Yes, thank you, Andrew, for the introduction. Thank you everybody for joining and Seiko for organizing this panel. Sorry for the bright color of my slides, but I thought this will probably keep colleagues in Europe awake and help us wake up here in Japan. So my presentation will be, in my presentation, I will try to look at what the attempts at reconciliation, which Professor Mimaki has already described in her presentation, meant for Japan's international standing and for Japan's reputation worldwide. In particular, I want to focus on the relationship between reconciliation and soft power and the role of history in this context. Politicians, political scientists, also politicians often forget the role of history in reconciliation. And full disclosure, I'm more a historian than a political scientist. But if you look at the most common and I guess widely accepted definition of soft power by Joseph Nye, who was one of the first political scientists writing about this, you can see that at the end of this definition, he adds history to one of the sources of soft power, as he calls it. And it is important to remember this because most people would probably associate this kind of stuff when you think about Japanese soft power in particular, and I don't need to explain this, but everybody knows Japan is very popular. Japanese popular culture is very popular all over the world, and it's a major source for Japan's soft power. Two colleagues of mine, as a result of this, have called Japan a soft power superpower. What might be important to underline here is that this is a highly political issue, that we are not talking about fun stuff, about media studies, about anime studies, but Japanese politics is massively instrumentalizing Japan's popular culture for political purposes. As you can see in this photograph, here you can see 5 anime characters and 1 politician, former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, in a campaign, obviously, to strengthen Japan's soft power by using the popular culture for this purpose. And Japan, over the decades after World War II in particular, has been very successful with this. There are some pre-war roots as well, but after World War II, Japan has built manifold institutions to increase its soft power worldwide. You can all find the details about this in the full paper, which I have uploaded to this site. But again, popular culture stands out. You can see here a photograph of a Japanese ambassador and standing in the middle of the photograph, and on the left is a foreign minister. The cat is the ambassador, Doraemon, a very famous Japanese anime character. If we look at the results of these attempts to use soft power to increase Japan's worldwide reputation, we can clearly see that Japan has been very successful since the end of the war. In soft power rankings, Japan generally is among the top 10. Here you can see the result of a 2012 BBC poll, in which Japan turned out to be Japan's most popular nation, at least in positive votes. And since that, Japan has dropped a little bit, which is part of the argument I am making in my paper. But still, generally, even today, Japan is has a very good reputation internationally. However, when it comes to history, the story is a little bit more ambiguous, and we have to count history in soft power because, as I referred to before, in most of the definitions of soft power, it does play a role, although most political scientists and also media studies people would rather look at other parts. So what I try to do in this paper is to look at how history after World War II played an important role at times at least to improve Japan's international reputation and to achieve reconciliation through active history politics. First of all, we have to state that Japan did this. So Japan, from the very beginning, right after World War II, Japan engaged in addressing its history as a part of reconciliation policies. It has done so actually just 2 days after the end of the war. This is not very widely known. I have written this in a couple of articles. But Japan, as you might know, surrendered on 2nd of September 1945. And 2 days later, on the 4th of September, the Japanese emperor gave a speech in the Japanese parliament, in the Diet, at that time still the Imperial Diet, in which he said, we're going to give up militarism now. We are going to build a peace state. And this is still a very important slogan in the framework of Japan's post-war identity until today. Japan as a peace state, as in distinction to Japan pre-war being a militarist state. And before 1945, militarism didn't even have a negative connotation. So Japan declared itself a militarist state before 1945. This was something that was affirmative, declared by Japanese governments about Japan itself. On 4th of September, 2 days after Japan's surrender was signed, the emperor says, no, forget about all of that. We are not militarist anymore. We will now build a peace state. And what you see here on the screen is the daily newspaper Asahi Shimbun 1 day later, on 5th of September, reporting this on page 1, Heiwa Kokka or Kakuditsu, establishing the peace state. So this was the new program given out by the emperor himself, who still at that time was the absolute sovereign and also the commander of the military, because the constitution had not been revised yet. So that was a very early start. However, in the following decades post-war, we can observe a number of stages of history politics. And in the first 2 to 3 decades, Japan was mainly following traditional policies of reconciliation, which usually meant after a war, somebody had to pay the bill. Apologizing for war was not very common in these days. So Japan paid reparations to a number of states. And only in the 1980s, a second stage began with more what we would today call reconciliatory policies, including apologies. And Professor Mimaki has already referred to that. So in 1995, the Prime Minister of Japan at that time gave a speech which was relatively well received in other Asian countries, in which he apologized for aggression and for colonial rule. But internationally, there are 2 very important points about this speech, apart from its contents, namely, first, that it was upheld by every single prime minister and every single cabinet until 2015. So this was not a one-timer, but Japanese governments after Mr. Murayama, every single administration reconfirmed the Murayama statement as Japan's official position regarding wartime responsibility and wartime history. And what is probably more important, and particularly I always emphasize this because it's totally forgotten in Japan today, this declaration, this Murayama Declaration, was also recognized internationally. Today, you will often hear in Japan that Korea and China never accepted Japanese apologies. This is total nonsense. You will hear this very often in Japan by people who say it's not helpful anymore to further apologize because the Koreans and the Chinese will never accept it anyway. Well, they have in 1998. In 1998, there were agreements between Japan on the one side and Korea and China, respectively, on the other side. And for example, in case of Korea, the text said, we now want to build a new Japan, Republic of Korea partnership towards the 21st century. And in this statement, Korean President Kim Dae-jung, here on the photograph on the left, and Japanese Prime Minister Obuchi Keizo agreed upon basically the wording of the Murayama statement as the Japanese official position. And Kim Dae-jung said, okay, we're going to accept this. This is your apology and let's move ahead now. This is exactly what this statement says. It is not entirely forgotten in Japan. If you go to the homepage of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, you will find it. It is still up there, but in Japanese discussions, it is actually very rarely mentioned. So all of this meant that in the 1990s, there was a positive impact that history politics made on Japan's soft power and Japan's international reputation. And in some other articles that I have written, I have spoken of the golden age of reconciliation in the 1980s, and particularly in the 1990s, Japan really made progress with reconciliation and seemed to be on a good track. However, this changed in the early 2000s. Oops, sorry. In the early 2000s, when successive governments began to say, well, we want to part with this apology politics. We don't want to continue apologizing till the end of time. But we will now rather shift to a policy of self-assertion. And so this was the government level. And below the government level, we see the emergence of historical revisionism in Japan, which obviously in the long run or in the midterm even had very negative impact on Japan's soft power and continues to do so until today. This was internationally reported quite intensively, sometimes maybe in a little bit exaggerated way, but here you have a couple of headlines from the early 2000s. Newsweek titled, "Why Japan Has No Friends. The long-running battle over its past now threatens the country's future." And we see here the Prime Minister of the early 2000s, Prime Minister Koizumi Junichiro, visiting the Yasukuni Shrine, a very controversial site of commemoration. And in later years, when Mr. Abe became Prime Minister, here on the left, you see the German international broadcaster Deutsche Welle reporting Japan's regional isolation higher than ever. And as I said, I mean, headlines, particularly cover headlines, are not even made by the journalists writing the articles, but even articles have to be very concise and on the point, and headlines have to be sexy to sell. But it shows that obviously there was a change here in the 2000s with regards to Japan's history policies. We also see, of course, as a background to this, everywhere all over Asia, here on the left, you can see protesters in Korea burning a Koizumi puppet. So you have anti-Japanese demonstrations in Korea and in China, but you also have anti-Chinese demonstrations and anti-Korean demonstrations in Tokyo. These are the other two photographs. And below these right-wing activities, we also see that popular public opinion is changing. For example, the attitudes towards China have become extremely negative in recent years. I will cut this short because of time, but we can clearly see from opinion polls that the Japanese have developed a very strong antipathy towards China, while if you look at the 1980s here, still an overwhelming majority of Japanese have positive attitudes, saying they feel affinity with China. This has now dramatically changed in the last 2 decades. And we do have opinion polls that show that this is, at least to a large degree, due to history politics. In concrete terms, what kind of history politics these are, it is to a large degree, it was very clear under the prime ministership of Abe Shinzo from 2012 to 2020. Mr. Abe, for example, criticized heavily the contents of history textbooks. He tried to revise or maybe even erase the so-called neighboring nations clause, which is a criterion in Japanese textbook examination and stipulates that the publishers have to take in consideration good relations with Korea and China when they describe Japan's wartime history. Mr. Abe was unable to completely erase this, but he has kind of done a lot of things to relativize it. He also, already in his first tenure in 2007, revised the Kono Declaration regarding the comfort women. He, in 2015, relativized the Murayama Statement. Originally, he wanted to replace the Murayama Statement by his own statement. He didn't do that, but he relativized the Murayama Statement and put his own statement next to it. And generally, he was very insensitive with regards to Japanese victims of war in Asia. Where do we stand now, and where are we? Where might we be going? Mr. Abe resigned last year. His successor, Prime Minister Suga, generally regarding politics says he wants to continue the policies of the Abe cabinet. And since last year, he has been busy basically with COVID policies and the preparation for the Tokyo Olympics. And he has not taken a lot of particular actions with regards to history so far. But in general, he continues the anti-intellectual approach of Mr. Abe. On the right side of the political spectrum, however, we can see a increasing fanatic measures, one could say, by the political right. So the title of this panel is Searching for the Middle. It is quite worrying that we see, like in other countries too, an increasing polarization of these debates regarding history, politics in Japan. For example, a few days ago, an exhibition with some controversial war-related contents in Nagoya was closed down after terrorist threats from the right wing. So we do clearly see that there is a radicalization of historical revisionism on the right political spectrum in Japan these days. On the other hand, we also see that progressive historians, intellectuals, and teachers come more often together in transnational settings and are still attempting to conduct transnational history research and history textbook research in particular. Historians from China, Korea, and Japan have published already several textbooks that can be used in Japanese high schools and that are used in some high schools in Japan, but also in Korea and in China, I'm not sure, and also in universities. One of these textbooks, which is actually a 2-volume set with the title A New Modern History of East Asia, has been published a few years ago in Japanese, Korean, and Chinese. And a couple of years ago, we have also published an English translation of this 2-volume book, which is here on the screen, which you also, by the way, can download entirely free if you go to the website of the German Georg Eckert Institute for International Textbook Research and you look under publications, you will be able to download the full text of this 2-volume set as one PDF entirely free. So my outlook is a little bit skeptical. As I said, there is an increasing polarization, like in many countries, we see increasing polarization of political issues and political debates. And I don't see at this point any indication that the government will shift towards the more progressive views, which would be necessary in order to transcend national boundaries and national limitations to thinking processes. And this is definitely not happening at this time. If anything, then actually transnational spaces are narrowing in the current situation of resurging nationalisms in East Asia. Thank you for your attention. This is my presentation. So I look forward to your questions later. Thank you.